So Chip, a Google search of emotions, especially if I search how many emotions are there, comes up with a lot of really interesting answers, sometimes definitive like 48.
Yeah.
Not sure about how that number was arrived, but one was pretty interesting. It says there are really only two, love and fear, and everything else is a derivation. You refer us to a really interesting diagram by Plutchik.
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
You know, it was interesting when I was getting my PhD in emotions, trying to understand, my emotions and then learn what kind of material was out there. I came across this guy, Robert Plutchik. We're all familiar with Isaac Newton's color wheel. You may not have known it was Isaac Newton, but the color wheel, red plus blue equals purple, is something we learned in kindergarten. But what I didn't know is that this guy, Robert Plutchik, Dr. Plutchik, 30 years ago had created an emotion wheel. He said there's a collection of 7 or 8 primary emotions, and then there's a bunch of secondary emotions. But the secondary emotions, like primary and secondary colors, come from mixing 2 primaries, leads to a secondary. And so the Robert Plutchik emotion wheel became something that gave me some confidence that my process of starting to actually look at how do emotions logically fit together as ingredients, like a recipe, or the idea that this plus that equals this, had some verification or academic ballast to it, that there was some history with that, and that's what ultimately led me to doing the research that led to my book, Emotional Equations.
So let's talk about the equations.
Mm-hmm.
First, just the basics. Tell us just about how do we do this? How do we add 2 emotions together and come up with something else, or even more complicated, divide or use square roots of emotions? Explain how.
Yeah, I've tried to keep the math relatively simple, and let's also recognize that math, this is not perfect math, but math is about relationships. It's usually the relationship of numbers. And so for those people who are listening to this and saying, I hate math, well, don't hate math. Just know that math is about relationships. We're going to talk about that math is the relationship of emotions here. There's a lot of and there's 4 primary ways that we actually use the math. It's either plus, minus, divide, or times. So what I looked at, and in each of the different emotions, whether it was anxiety or happiness or curiosity, I went out and talked to the experts in the field, and I said, what are the influencers that affect, say, anxiety? And what are the elements? It's almost like, if you think about the external weather, there are a collection of things, ingredients that create the weather that you have. Now, in San Diego, you always have good weather, but that's not true in a lot of other places. And it's everything from elevation to barometric pressure to humidity. That collection of things creates the weather that's happening outside. We have internal weather, and there's a collection of ingredients happening inside of us that when they mix in a certain way will make us angry or jealous or grateful or maybe full of faith or belief. And so that's what I started to look at, and I looked at the math of how if you combine this plus this, it might equal that.
So what I found really interesting about that is it was pretty simple when I thought about adding 2 together to equal another.
Yep.
But it really started to get interesting when I looked at the ones that were, say, a multiplier.
Yeah.
And I could start to play with which ones of these might leverage that emotion the most or impact that emotion the most. As you started to put together the formulas, was there anything that, how did you arrive at which ones were additive and which ones were multiplicative?
Well, again, it's in the abstract. It may be easier to talk about a particular emotion around this, but let me just say in the abstract, what I looked at was when the expert in the field told me that, for example, anxiety, that the 2 components of anxiety tends to be what you don't know, uncertainty, and what you can't control, powerlessness. When you have these things happening at the same time, it's combustible. So it's not a plus, it's a times, because the effect of uncertainty and powerlessness together create something that's much larger than each one individually. And that allowed me to have some confidence of saying, okay, it's anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness as opposed to plus.
So an exponential effect as opposed to an incremental effect.
That's right. And in a division equation, whatever's in the denominator, you have a numerator and then you have a denominator. What's in the bottom, the denominator, has a profound effect on whatever it is that's the resulting product. And the fact is, if you have a big bottom, it's going to actually shrink whatever's over here. And if you have a very small bottom, it means that whatever's in the top is magnified a little bit. So that's it's complicated when you start thinking of it that way too much. But when you get it to the preciseness of the specific emotions, it starts to make more sense.